I'm Ron Klaus again. I'm calling this talk, Do We Need Morals? There's a perspective on morality that's growing that says we ought to be free to do what we want to do if it makes us happy, as long as we don't hurt anyone else, at least directly. Whether we say that explicitly, a lot of us today are trying to live like that. But in this talk, I want to ask us, is this approach to life going to lead to happiness as we think it will? This idea about how to obtain happiness has cropped up at various times in history, but got somewhat embedded in Western thinking through a philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived at about the time of the American Revolutionary War. His idea was that it is civilization, with all its rules and regulations, that's the source of human misery. He wanted us to go back to nature, to the time before civilization's rules. If we become free from the rules that our cultures have impressed on us, that will lead to greater happiness. He especially advocated sexual freedom. Many people living today, perhaps some of you listening right now, are trying to live with this ethic. But today we want to ask whether that is as good an idea as it first seems. Let's begin with something I discovered during the time I was doing engineering. One of my most recent projects was to work on ways to produce more efficient gas-powered electric generation systems. A great deal of our electric power is generated from natural gas because it's one of our most abundant resources. But here's the problem. If you design a system to get the most electricity you can from, say, a cubic feet of gas, the capital cost of the generator is very high. But if you limit its cost, you make the conversion more inefficient. So what do? You have to make a compromise and try to hit some kind of a sweet spot that keeps the capital cost of the machine at a reasonable level, but still gets as much efficiency as you can. This is what engineers call optimizing the system. It involves their using a certain amount of judgment about what energy executives will spend on a generator as they evaluate the designs. Now, what I want to put out in this talk is that life is something like an optimization problem as well. We don't live merely as individuals. We're part of a society, which is a social system. We can try to optimize the human system in various ways. The problem is that we optimize with only our own interests at heart and don't take into account the aspirations and of the greater society in which we live, we may not get what we hoped for. For example, my wife and I work, at least when COVID and political stability allow, in an overseas developing country. I met with the community leaders in a town where a large company that had employed a large number of people in the town just pulled up stakes and left, increasing unemployment significantly. The community leaders were very upset and very angry at that company because of the hardship that their leaving had on their people. So after listening to the moans and groans for a while, I started to ask some question. I asked, how's the housing in this town? Were the employees finding good, affordable housing? No, they said, we admit good housing is a problem in our town. Well, how about your schools? Were they attractive to people who work for the company? No, we admit that they were pretty run down. Good teachers were hard to come by because the pay is so low. Well, what about the roads coming into and out of your town? Would the company be able to get their trucks in and out in good shape? No, we know that our roads are in pretty bad shape. How about your phone system? Did it work well? No interrupted calls, etc.? No, our phone system is actually pretty bad. You often can't get your calls through. I didn't have to draw the conclusion. Finally, one of them stopped me. I think I see what you're saying. We don't make this an attractive place for them to settle. The company management finally got tired of all this inconvenience and left for a better town. Is that what you're trying to say? I asked, well, why weren't the facilities better? It was clear that the people didn't want to pay enough taxes to make their town a desirable place. Thus, the factories picked up stakes and left and moved to greener pastures. I'm sorry to say that this is often the scenario in underdeveloped countries and communities. For the most part, their people don't optimize the whole system. They just want to get the most they can immediately for themselves. They think they're too poor to do that. But they don't realize that their own actions are exactly what keeps them in poverty. This is a social example that also requires a certain kind of optimization. It's people would have to give up some things and have to pay some more taxes to make their town a better place to live. If they didn't do that, they couldn't attract businesses and they would lose out in the long run. This is a repeated problem. Even the city we lived here in the US for 26 years and where we raised our children had various pockets of poverty. In one of them, where my wife worked, I used to walk and see block after block of large factories closed and boarded up. Why? because the short-sighted city governments raised taxes on these companies high enough that they weren't competitive anymore. And so they left, leaving the neighborhoods blighted and very poor. The city government saw these companies as a cash cow to be milked for their own purposes, but made that part of city poor because of their short-sightedness. Furthermore, their available taxes decreased as well because they lost the companies that would have paid them. It goes even beyond economics. You may have heard recently about the recent scandals about Hugh Hefner's Playboy Club. Hefner died not so long ago, but a lot more is coming out about his enterprise. It was supposed to be a place where he, some of his friends, and a group of women could have whatever relationships they wanted. But now it's come out that many of the women felt seriously exploited. Some of them claimed to have been raped, others that they felt humiliated, others felt that they would be blackmailed if they left. What it says is that the ethic of personal pleasure seeking makes it hard to find the boundaries of when it doesn't hurt anyone else. In fact, who decides when it doesn't hurt anyone else? The person like Hefner who is indulging himself, or the women who feel exploited? Now you can say this is an extreme case, but we've had numerous experiences much closer to home. There was a young woman who was very close to both my wife and me. One day she mentioned to us that she was moving in to live with a man she had met. She had known him to be a womanizer, having had many sexual partners. But he told her that she was now the love of his life, and he would always be faithful to her alone. They agreed that if anything would come between them, they would discuss it and work out a solution together. It was only a short time before they were together that she discovered that he hasn't changed, and he became involved with another woman. She was very upset and told him that they needed to talk about what had happened. When she asked about their commitment to talk out differences, he refused and told her that in this case, that was a private decision, and their commitment to talk about such things didn't apply. She moved out, quite hurt and disillusioned. I wish I could tell you this was the only time we heard something like this, but such behavior and its consequences are widespread. A critic of Rousseau's proposal put it this way: it is not our civilization that is the villain. Civilization is what restrains the real villains. Okay, now we move on to an even deeper understanding of what's going on, and we turn to a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville, who lived during the early part of the 19th century. He made an extensive visit to America to try to understand what made this nation tick. He concluded that the vitality of this new social experiment lay in part in its embrace of what came to be called its social capital. This involved a set of shared values and relationships of trust between individuals that allows them to work together for the common good. In my optimization language, it means that they optimize the system of relationships, not merely exclusively their personal interests. That enabled them to benefit from the mutual trust with others. The expectation would be that the best way to pursue our own happiness is when the system of relationships in which we live is optimized. The idea of social capital is that cooperation, trust, and a common set of values is what leads to the greatest long-term happiness if we embrace it. But that means a commitment sometimes to restrain ourselves because certain values we have that require us to do that. So for example, my father was able to get loans for his business from his bank with little more than a handshake. That was because there was enough trust between them that the bank knew he would do his utmost to repay the loan. Admittedly, he had to put up collateral, but their transaction was still built on a high trust relationship. Both sides understood the good that would come to them both out of the attention to repayment. When Social Security was instituted in the days of President Franklin Roosevelt, my father was opposed, not because he was cheap, but because he believed that taking care of aging members of one's family ought to be the family's job, not the government's. He put his money where his mouth was through extensive financial help to both sets of my grandparents. I had some close relatives on my parents' generation who had a very difficult marriage. I know that because our frequent visits, I overheard his wife's woes unloaded to my mother. But because their commitment to continue their marriage, if at all possible, they did it and they stuck it out. Toward the end of their lives, the wife started going blind. Somehow that touched her husband, and he tenderly cared for her until her death. They ended their life together on a very happy note. By way of contrast, my relatives in the generation after mine have gone through multiple divorces. Why the change? they are more affluent and more educated than my generation. It's because divorce has not only become more acceptable, it has often been seen as inevitable. It's now been established that parental divorce often traumatizes their children. So is nobody hurt by this? Who decides who gets hurt and whether there is hurt? So what's happening? I think there can be very little argument about the fact that we're becoming increasingly fragmentized in our society, and we have to ask, why is that? My take is that it is a symptom of the gradual dying of social capital. And what is driving that? As I've watched this throughout my life, it seems to me that there are two factors. First is our increasing affluence. It seems to me that the more you have, the more you want. Our increasing bank accounts don't make us more willing to take care of aging parents, for example. They make us more interested in putting them into extended care facilities than into caring for them personally. The second is the advent of birth control. That has turned sexual relationships away from being a pleasurable bond that can hold a marriage and a family together to something that's primarily for a person's immediate pleasure. Are there alternatives to this? One might be tempted to return to the so-called golden rule. That is, treat other people the way we would like to be treated if the tables were turned and we were in the other person's position. Or another way of putting it is, it's not wrong to pursue your own interests, but make sure that what we do would be what we would want to experience were we in the other person's position. Okay, back to the original question, which I hope to be fun to discuss. Do we need morals that sometimes restrain the villain in us? Have fun with this. See you next time.